Welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests from all over the world. And tonight, we are going to look at a few of the almost 100 active canonization causes for sainthood for people who were born right here in the United States of America. Or if they weren't born here, they lived a majority of their lives here. Before we get to talking about these folks, we'd like to talk briefly with EWTN's John Elson about a new EWTN program that is premiering next week. It originated in Ireland, but we're going to show it to the whole world. John, what do you have for us?
Thank you, Father. It's good to be with you. And I want to let our audience know that, as you said, next Wednesday, October 20th at 10 p.m. Eastern, and Saturday, October 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern, we'll be debuting an original docudrama entitled Speak of the Devil, Spiritual Warfare. As you mentioned, our colleagues in EWTN Ireland, Campbell Miller and Aidan Gallagher, along with a cast of dozens of other actors and technical support people, produced this very interesting docudrama, which is a combination of a dramatized retelling of the story of the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son, along with expert interviews to speak of the battle that each of us is fighting, the war that each of us is in for the advancement and the preservation of our souls. And so we have a number of experts. We appreciated your valuable contributions in the show, along with those of Paul Thigpen, Thomas Sullivan, Father John Horgan, Father Patrick Collins. And so we really wanted to shine a light on a couple things. One, in St. Paul's second letter to St. Timothy, he talks about us being soldiers of Jesus Christ. So when we're in this battle, we present the content and these spiritual reflections that are important not only for spiritual meditation, but for practical application. So we talk about military strategy, military tactics. How does the devil, who in the 8th chapter of St. John's Gospel is a murderer and liar from the beginning, how does he work his deadliness? How does he work his doubts? How does he work his accusations? And how do the sacramentals and the sacraments of the faith, especially Eucharist and confession, help us to withstand and heal from venial and mortal sin? So we're really excited about this particular program. We feel it's going to be a blessing to all of our audience, and we're so grateful to our viewers for giving us their prayers and other support to make this program possible.
Yeah, I was able to watch it before, and I'm very, very impressed. It's really well done and really entertaining. So looking forward to that, and that'll be on Wednesday, October 20th at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, and repeated on Saturday, October 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Adapt that to your own time zone. And check out other things EWTN is doing in Ireland by going to EWTNIreland.com, EWTNIreland.com, or EWTN.ie. Stands for Ireland. All right, John, thank you.
Thank you, Father.
We'll be back in just a couple of minutes with tonight's guest. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Our guest tonight has been enlightening EWTN viewers with amazing stories of miracle workers, stories about martyrs for our faith, and ordinary people living extraordinary lives of heroic virtue. Lately, his spotlight has been on the saints, blesseds, venerables, and servants of God who were either born here in the United States or lived most of their lives here in America. And you can see his show, which is a great program. It's called They Might Be Saints. That's on Fridays at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on EWTN. He has other shows such as The Miracle Hunter and Explore with the Miracle Hunter. You can see those programs anytime you want on at ondemand.ewtn.com. It's ondemand.ewtn.com. Now, he has a new book. It's his newest one. It's called They Might Be Saints on the Path to Sainthood in America. So joining us from the great city of Chicago, or at least one of its suburbs, he's here with Skype. Welcome, Mr. Michael O'Neill. Michael, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today.
Thank you. Thank you much. And this is, I think, an important thing. I can remember as a child, being excited that Mother Cabrini, who spent a significant time in Chicago and died there, her body was snatched. There were body snatchers that took it to New York and wouldn't give it back. But she did die in Chicago at Cabrini Hospital, just down the street from where I used to work at Holy Family Parish. And we were excited that an American citizen, she wasn't born here, but she was an American citizen, had become a saint. But now it's turning out that, there are plenty of saints. And as is typical of the Catholic Church, these saints have a variety of different kinds of activities that made them saints. And this is what you've been investigating, right?
That's right. We have 24 different venerables and blesseds featured in this book and featured on the television show. Mm-hmm. And I think the book is kind of interesting because for people who don't know, there are 4 steps to sainthood: servant of God, venerable, blessed, and saint. Yep. So before you get to saint, these are the people who might be saints. And so we've been shining the light on these people in the show and also in the book.
Just to give a quick review before we go into individual cases, what is it that gets somebody to become a servant of God, and then a venerable, then a blessed, and then a saint? What is it that is necessary for each of those steps, briefly?
Absolutely. And so in the book itself, They Might Be Saints, I have a whole chapter dedicated to how saints are made and then how miracles are found. And so when it comes to the step of venerable, going from servant of God to venerable, the life of heroic virtue of that candidate must be investigated and established by Rome. And so once they have been stamped with that approval of venerable, then their cause is in search of a miracle. And so they use miracles that are intercessory miracles of situations where it's a serious illness, not liable to go in its own. It must be instantaneous, complete, and lasting. And most difficult of all, there can be no medical treatment that relates to the cure. And maybe even more difficult than that is it must be a case of singular intercession. I don't know about you, Father, but when I need some help, I'm calling on all my friends, the saints in heaven, hoping that somebody picks up the phone up there. But when it comes to canonization causes, if you were to go to the Pope and say, I had this miracle, but maybe it was Mother Teresa, maybe it was John Paul II, maybe it was Saint Therese, but I think it was this potential saint, I'm pretty sure the Vatican would say, congratulations on your miracle, but we're not going to use that for a canonization. And so they have to be cases where they pray just to that one saint. Even the family members have to direct their prayers in a singular way. So it's a very difficult thing to get to blessed, and then another miracle gets you to be a saint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the idea of the miracles is to show that God is the one who ultimately approves it. The saints don't work miracles, God does. But he listens to their intercession. As we see in Scripture, when the 24 elders are around the throne of God with bowls of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And that's in Revelation chapter 5, verse 8. So it's a good to understand that. Now, given that we've got this process of moving towards sainthood. And by the way, and just so folks also understand, that doesn't mean that nobody else is in heaven. That's not what that means. It just means that these are the ones the church will put out there for public imitation. You can listen to what their teachings as being solid. You can imitate their actions as being truly virtuous, and you can seek their intercession in a public forum. Would that be right?
That's right. I like to say that we have the lowercase s saints. That's anybody who gets up there to heaven.
Yep.
And then you have the uppercase s saints. And those are the people who have been recognized by the church and held up as great intercessors and by living a life of virtue that can be imitated. So we have those two different varieties of saints in heaven.
And then we'll celebrate the lowercase s for saints in just a few weeks on the feast of All Saints' Day. We celebrate All Saints' Day, not so much Halloween. Secular society likes the goblins, ghosts, and scary people because you know whose side they're on. But we celebrate the saints who are in heaven. Now, let's take a look at a few. You're living close to Chicago. Some of these saints lived there. Is that not true?
Absolutely. We have a handful of saints. When you go from Mother Cabrini, who's a legitimate saint or who's made it all the way to the fourth step, but we also have people like Mother Maria Kaupas or Mary Therese Dudzik, or we have Augustus Tolton, the first Black African-American priest who will become a saint someday. He's a venerable, and his cause is run here right out of Chicago as well. So there are a number of people who are recognized here in Chicago. So that's kind of exciting for us Chicagoans.
Yes, it is. And, you know, given some of the problems that have been going on in the streets of Chicago, we need that kind of intercession for the city. There'll be a lot of intercession needed, you know, for people to have a change of heart and not be so violent. Give us some of your own favorite saints besides fellow Chicago citizens. Who would be some of the saints that you would want to look to in particular?
Well, there are some saints who many people know. So that would be Blessed Michael McGivney, the founder of the Knights of Columbus. Or we have Father Patrick Peyton, who before Pope John Paul II, more people had seen him live than any other person in the history of the world. So these are big name future saints. But then we have other people like Augustus Tolton that I mentioned, Blessed Solanus Casey from Detroit, the great miracle worker who was born here in the United States and will be a saint someday because they have so many miracles that they're considering through his intercession. Yes. And then, of course, I'm a big fan of Bishop Frederick Baraga, the snowshoe priest from Upper Peninsula, Michigan. He dedicated his life to serving the native people there, the copper miners, spreading the gospel, putting on snowshoes, traveling for thousands of miles over the course of a lifetime. So it's he's an impressive saint.
And it's important to note that he was walking around northern Michigan way before global warming. As a matter of fact, back in his day, they're at the end of what they call a mini ice age. It was colder. This, you can imagine being, you know, up there crossing Michigan in snowshoes. You know, it's enough to go through Detroit traffic with an expressway, but going through, you know, the Upper Peninsula with snowshoes. In fact, one of our radio affiliates is named after Bishop Frederick Baraga, you know, because he was so admirable in what he did there. And he really cared for the rights of the Native Americans as well as the salvation of their souls.
Absolutely. He was a lawyer before he became a priest. And so he dedicated his life to getting them land rights and ownership of the land itself, which in the 1800s, that was something that was not done or even considered. So he made a huge contribution to the Native people, also writing the dictionary of the Ojibwa language and the grammar. And so he taught them the faith. And so I think that he was invited by those tribes to baptize them. So it was not an imposition of the Catholic faith, it was an invitation. And so he stands out as a great example. Anytime we're wondering, are we doing enough to evangelize? We need to read the chapter about Bishop Barriga in my book, because his life of sacrifice and evangelization is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. And besides Bishop Barriga, you have other priests and religious that you include here?
Absolutely. You have Bishop Alphonse Gallegos from California, the Bishop of the Barrio, as he's called. And so he was featured on They Might Be Saints, the television program as well. So we have a number of bishops and priests, and as I mentioned, Father Michael McGivney, the very first parish priest who was beatified just last October. So there's a whole spectrum of people who have been included in this book. And I think that anybody can find somebody who appeals to them in a special way.
You know, talk a little bit about Bishop Gallegos from that. He's not that long ago. I mean, the photograph of him is color. It's not a drawing.
That's right.
So tell us a little bit more about him and his work.
And so what is remarkable about Bishop Gallegos is he was born in Arizona or the Southwest, and he came to California, and he entered. He went to a school and a parish. His eyesight was very bad, but for whatever reason, he was able to overcome that, and he entered religious life, became a priest, and then went on to serve the local community. So he's popular for kind of walking around through these gang-infested areas around Los Angeles and sort of just talking to the kids, talking to the parents, bringing everybody together in a way that was saintly, they thought. And he went on to become the Bishop of Sacramento. And a lot of people are inspired just sort of by his openness and his devotion. And I think just somebody with those disabilities coming in and then going all the way to becoming a venerable and someday perhaps a saint is inspirational to a lot of people.
Not to mention his great choice in hats.
Well, he at least he wore a mitre at some point. I'm not sure about his other
the cowboy hats are just too cool. But he was also well known because he was impressed by the way local folks would trick out their vehicles. And he just loved the mechanics of that and just became involved in their world. And by loving what they did and being impressed by it, he also showed them respect and was able to announce the gospel to folks that otherwise might be fairly dismissive of a priest.
Absolutely. I think that he would go out as the Bishop of the Barrio and talk to these lowriders and bring the gospel to them, and that might inspire them to join the church. And so I think that one of the interesting things when we filmed that episode is we had an actor who looked exactly like Alphonse Gallegos. He was the spitting image. And so we actually brought him back to his old parish in order to film there. And the people there thought they were seeing a ghost or the apparition of a saint, because the people came up, they wanted autographs with him, they wanted photos with him, and the whole church was packed as he gave a fake homily. But it was actually just like bringing him back to life for just a brief moment. That was one of my favorite moments in filming They Might Be Saints.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. You also have a number of religious sisters. The legacy of Catholicism in the United States is so tied in with the religious sisters who did so much. Tell us about a couple of them.
So we have Mother Maria Kaupas from Chicago, who is the founders of the Sisters of St. Casimir. We also have the Chicago Franciscans with Mary Therese Dudzik. We also have Miriam Teresa Demjanovic, who joined the Sisters of Charity in New Jersey, died at the age of 24, making her one of the youngest American future saints. And these are all people who lived life in a big way for the Lord. And so we talk about Miriam Teresa Demjanovic, for example. She talked about holiness in everyday life, sort of the universal call to holiness. And that was something well before Vatican II. So I think that, some of these people who founded these orders and wrote these great spiritual treatises, they were spiritual geniuses or mystics, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great to see their the light shined on their life and their work.
Mm-hmm. Because one of the things about the ones you mentioned, um, you know, Sister Maria Kalpas is from Lithuania, and
Yes.
Demjanowicz and Dzuzik are also from Eastern Europe. These are folks who came to America, not knowing English and not being familiar with our ways, but in their work with immigrant communities, transformed America. They helped these immigrants become part of the American life, and to maintain their Lithuanian or Polish or I guess Demjanowicz was from I wasn't sure her home country, Croatia.
No,
No.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't remember her home country, but the folks that belong to those ethnic communities maintain pride in who they are, justifiably, and at the same time came to be good Americans and took on this double identity with Catholicism as overriding any of the national interests. And that's one of the great gifts that the sisters brought in their education process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that doing the program has allowed me to gain some insight into some of these saints and to find out about their communities. We filmed at these convents and other places where their communities are located, and it's just been a very special thing to get to know the sisters a little bit and to see the impact that their foundress has had.
Yeah. That's a very important part. And laity, do you have any laity in this book?
The majority of Americans on the path to sainthood are priests and religious, and of course that's the reason why is we have their orders are the ones who are funding and staffing the canonization efforts. But we do have people like Pierre Toussaint, who is a former slave who went on to become a businessman. He's an African American, and there are a number of causes of African Americans in process. Augustus Tolton, Henriette DeLille from Louisiana, and we have Toussaint as well. So I think that his example of sort of being able to use his work in a way and not necessarily have to be a priest in order to evangelize and spread the faith was an impressive thing. So there's a lot of people that we're looking forward to their example and their story being known.
Yeah, this is an important part. And with Toussaint, what would be some of the key elements of his path to sanctity?
Well, what's interesting is that he and his wife together seemed like they were great evangelizers, and he was known for his work, working with his clients, and I think just having that opportunity to be one-on-one with clients and talking about the faith and the gospel, he had sort of a captive audience where he could both show his life of virtue and also tell them about the faith. So I think he used the occasions of everyday life in order to spread the gospel, and that's something we all need to do.
Yeah. And I don't remember if you were also dealing with Black Elk, a Native American. I don't know if you included him.
So Nicholas Black Elk, his name is mentioned in the final chapter of the book where we talk about servants of God. And so this book has 24 venerables and blesseds. And then at the very end, we give people sort of a preview of saints to come in the United States. So there are as many as 100 canonization causes in the United States, one of which is Nicholas Black Elk, who is a Native American who, using Native American spirituality, found his way to Catholicism as well. So I think that there's plenty of people, if you look at that last chapter, who might be saints someday.
Yeah, it's a number of my Jesuit brothers who work at the reservations up in the Dakotas are working to research his life and present the information, because Black Elk not only became a Catholic, it's not just becoming Catholic isn't enough to make you a saint. But he became himself a great catechist. And he lived in what, into the 1920s and 30s, where he was still evangelizing and catechizing people in the faith. And it's odd to me that he's known fairly well for his book about his Native American spirituality in Black Elk Speaks, but they didn't tell the rest of the story, how that is what led him towards Catholicism and toward the accepting the faith that, you know, from the Jesuit missionaries to the reservation, and, you know, also becoming a very committed Catholic who evangelized many others. Again, without denying the goodness and wonder of his own Native American existence and his background as a Lakota Sioux.
I agree. And I think one of my favorite episodes, I hope someday to do an episode on Nicholas Black Elk, but one of my favorite episodes was on the Martyrs of La Florida. These were Appalachian Native Americans who converted to Catholicism through the Spanish, and they were actually martyred by the English, defending the Eucharist and defending the faith. And I think, you know, again, when we all look for inspiration of how can we better evangelize or stand up for our faith, we don't have to go too much further than these Native Americans living in Florida who became known as the Martyrs of La Florida. So there are plenty of great stories to go around.
Yeah, these martyrs, there was a lot of fighting between the English, the French, and the Spanish over control of what became their colonies in the southern United States. And the Native Americans got, you know, enmeshed in some of this, as had happened with the Iroquois and the Huron up in the north. You know, that the Europeans were using the Native Americans to help continue European fights. But as far as these folks in La Florida were concerned, it was especially the Franciscan missionaries. I think there were some Jesuits there as well, and these Native Americans who stood for the faith and were not dying in battles, but they were martyred. They gave up their lives to protect the Eucharist and to stay firm in their Catholic faith.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, those are models of holiness for all of us, and they're servants of God now. They have not been officially declared saints. They might be saints, but I feel like that one's a slam dunk, that someday we'll see those Martyrs of La Florida canonized saints.
You know, one of the things that I think is important about what you're writing here with these American candidates for sanctity is, in this present context, we have, in many ways, attacks on American history. I think that there is, on one hand, a lack of knowledge of American history. I'm sometimes appalled at how little people know of the presidents and other figures, which is not good. You know, I remember hearing one lady, they were asking who was the first president back on President's Day, and most people got it wrong. And one lady who did get it right said George Washington, said, yeah, he was president around 1940 something or other. And you say, oy, oy, oy. So we don't know secular American history. We have forces that try to destroy monuments to American history. We've been seeing that. And attacking, say, St. Junipero Serra, you know, and his memory and his memorials, and burning churches that he built. With this kind of attack on American history, in order to cleanse the memory and rebuild a whole new culture, that's what is going on. We have this Catholic history. And what do you think would be important for us to know in dealing with this present situation? Why is it important for us to know about these Catholic, servants of God, venerables, blesseds, and saints? What can they help us understand about our American history?
Well, I think one of the important things is that when you read the book, They Might Be Saints, we have 24 chapters on people who lived at various points throughout American history. So it's almost like reading a little bit of a history book because you find out what's going on in the United States at the time that they lived. And the real message is that no matter where you live here in America or what time you live in, you have a contribution to make. And you can spread the gospel and you can bring the faith by your life. And so I think that people who read these different chapters might connect with one future saint over another, but they'll see that these saints had an impact where they were in the world and the time they were in the world. So, I think that knowing that there were real people who walked here on American soil that who will be saints or who might be saints someday, that's inspirational for a lot of people, I'm sure.
Yeah. Michael, we have to take a break right now. We'll come back in a couple of minutes, but we want to encourage people to watch They Might Be Saints with Michael O'Neill. That's shown Fridays at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on EWTN. And you can get it anytime you want if you go to ondemand.ewtn.com. ondemand.ewtn.com. And especially if you read his book and you become fascinated with one or other of these characters, you can see that that episode on demand or catch the Friday episodes too. Well, Michael, we'll take a break. We'll come back in 2 minutes and continue on our conversation. All right, we are speaking with Michael O'Neill, who has written a fine book called They Might Be Saints on the Path to Sainthood in America. And before we get back to that conversation, just want to invite you to join EWTN, plus Relevant Radio, plus the Napa Institute in praying the Rosary during the month of October for an end to abortion and for an outpouring of support for expectant mothers, and I would add for the mothers who have a number of children. I keep hearing from mothers who have large families that they get criticism for having so many children. I think someone's going to be answering to God for all that. I mean, He gave them, what do you want, take them, put them back? What, crazy? But at any rate, if you want more information about joining us in this rosary, go to EWTN.com or relevantradio.com or napa-institute.org and find out more about joining us in these rosaries for life. Okay? Now, Michael, let's get back to you and your book. One of the things, as we've been discussing, is that we see that these candidates not only bring us back through history, and as you mentioned, that your book is like a little bit of an introduction to American history, but they really do represent America. You've got Hispanics, you've got immigrants, African Americans, you've got Native Americans, all kinds of the variety that is the United States. and this great diversity that are being represented. And one of the questions that would come to mind is, who do you think is in the lead to become the next saint? I don't want to. My dad used to work at the racetrack, so maybe I think that way. But who would be in the lead, as best you can say, for the next beatification and canonization?
Now, I don't think there's any Vegas odds on any of these future saints. However, and I don't want to influence in anything, but I've talked to so many of these causes, and I've been so blessed to do television shows about them. And one of the very recent programs that aired on October 5th was that of Francis Xavier Seelos from Germany, who immigrated to the United States, and he's a blessed. And his first miracle was the healing of a cancer years ago to this woman named Angela Boudreau. And then since then, they've built a shrine, as you're allowed to do once someone is declared blessed. And now they have a case which looks very promising. And that was the case that was featured in the episode of They Might Be Saints, about a child who went through a traumatic birth. They expected the child to die or to be at least mentally compromised and have great disabilities. And the child was born. And after he was blessed with a relic and crucifix of Blessed Seelos, the boy recovered and recovered further and recovered further. And that case is going to Rome. So I think that, to me, that is a clear case of singular intercession and no medical treatment that would have helped that situation. And so my money might be on Blessed Francis Xavier Seelos. But of course, you have any of the other blesseds like Solanus Casey. He has so many claims of miracles that were in his life and afterwards that I feel like he's got a great chance too. And then you have Blessed Miriam Teresa Demjanovic, another blessed, and Blessed Michael McGivney, of course, with the power of the saints or the power of the knights behind that. They'll be getting the word out for Father Michael McGivney, and he was featured on our show as well. So, I think, the odds makers would put their money on those top 3 or 4.
And, for these, Seelos, where did Blessed Seelos live?
So he grew up in Germany, modern day Germany, but then he immigrated to the United States when he felt he was called to be a missionary. He saw a vision of the Virgin Mary in a dream and told his brother, I believe now that I should be a missionary. So he wrote letters to all his family members. He didn't say goodbye in person, and he came to the United States. And he traveled all over the United States in a mission band. He was in Pittsburgh with St. John Neumann. He then eventually, at the end of his life, he went to New Orleans. And he knew ahead of time that it was a dangerous place. And he said, I am going to die there in New Orleans of yellow fever. He knew that was a potential, yet he went anyway, was obedient. And sure enough, he tended to the sick there, and he died of yellow fever. And so in these pandemic days, he's quite an interesting saint to look at. I think he's got great potential.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. And there really is a lot of concern or interest in him as well. Someone that I also featured on my show, we talked about him, was Father Aloysius Schwartz. Another fascinating character, also a missionary. Tell us a little bit about him.
Venerable Father Al Schwartz is one of my favorite future saints, and that was one of the best episodes that I think we did. We traveled to Mexico. He's a priest from Washington, D.C., who set up these homes all over the world for children, and hundreds of thousands of children have gone through these homes. And not only have their lives been saved from poverty, but these children go on to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and functional members of society. And so I was blessed with the opportunity to go to Mexico, to Chalco, which is this town outside of Mexico City, and to the La Villa de las Niñas, this girls' town where they have something like 4,000 girls there. And to see these girls, they've been pulled off the streets and they've been transformed, and the way they adore the Eucharist and the way that they study science and math and languages is just absolutely amazing. And so Father Al, it's the power of what one man can do, one man of faith, And he is most certainly a saint in my book, just based on the sacrifice that he made. And I'm quite sure that Rome will catch up at some point, and they'll approve a miracle to make him a blessed and then a saint. But
Sure.
Father Al Schwartz is one of the great inspirations, and the chapter in the book, They Might Be Saints, is really, I think, opens your eyes to the way that he helped the children in Philippines, Korea, Mexico, and otherwise. Absolutely incredible life of just one man.
Yeah, exactly. And, he helped start a community of sisters to, staff these different homes. And they're still going strong.
Absolutely.
He passed away some time ago, but, not that long ago. Certainly.
No, 1990s. He died of
Yeah.
ALS. I think he'll, likely become the patron saint of such diseases as ALS. He was in a wheelchair for the last years of his life. But I have to say that when I went to Mexico to see that home, I'm not much of a crying person, but I was brought to tears to see the incredible work of Father Al Schwartz. It was truly amazing. I like to say it was one of the greatest miracles that I have ever seen as the miracle hunter. It's truly amazing.
Yeah, yeah. And, this is an element that I think all of us can take a look at, where we have all lots of limitations. But with these different individuals, they didn't let the limitations, say, of language, they didn't let the limitations of race, that some in times when race people were bigoted against, not only in society in general, but in the church. Think of Father Tolton in particular, who wasn't allowed to study in a seminary in the United States because of his race. But Rome did welcome him, and he studied there and was ordained a priest there. And other limitations that people had, like physical disabilities with Father Schwartz, none of those limitations stop them from sanctity. And I think this is one of the very key points of what we have in the growth to holiness, that holiness is a gift from God, and human limitations don't prevent the growth of holiness. And we have to keep that in mind and make that a goal when our society doesn't make morality a goal, yet alone holiness.
Yeah, I think each of these saints, the 24 that we feature in the book and in the episodes of They Might Be Saints, they all they had to overcome something, but they all had faith, and that got them through.
Yep.
In the cases of Father Al Schwartz or Bishop Alphonse Gallegos with his limited vision, or any of these others who went through great difficulties, or Father Nelson Baker, who's a venerable, building a basilica in his 70s or 80s. I can't remember how old he was, but all these people have gone through these great trials and tribulations and challenges. And I think people are going to kind of get inspired to learn these stories. So I had a lot of fun writing the book and learning about the things that these saints worked through on their own and with God's help. Yeah.
One of the saints, or hopefully to be, we mentioned earlier, but I'd like to go into. I had the opportunity to see him. I know people might be surprised, but I was too shy to introduce myself. But I saw Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen giving a retreat to Lutheran pastors at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. And I was taking my introductory Greek class at that seminary at the time. And I was walking by the auditorium. I heard a voice that I recognized because we watched Bishop Sheen on television growing up in the 50s. And I stopped, and I would go in there every day to listen to him. But I said I was just a little too shy to introduce myself. But what do you see as the process for him right now? What's the likelihood for this first televangelist in history? What do you see going on with him?
Yeah, between he and Father Patrick Peyton, the two media priests, as we might say, who've put us in this position now to be able to spread the gospel over through the media. These are two great predecessors of ours. But I think that we talk about Fulton Sheen. He is the only case in the world that has an approved by Rome miracle, and he's not headed towards beatification in this moment. I think that everyone else, once they get that miracle approved, that opens the doors to beatification. And of course, his beatification got postponed. And so right now we're sort of in this limbo, as it were, just waiting to hear news on what will be happening next, when that will be scheduled. But I'm 100% sure that it will happen. It's just a matter of the timing of it all. And who knows what forces were in play to pause that canonization or beatification. But I think that's something to pray for, and something that we will see soon someday.
And I hope so too. As a matter of fact, I even saw that there's now an Archbishop Sheen app you can download for free, and you can listen to so many of his talks because he did so much in the media, whether it was audio tapes or one of my favorites is his introduction to Catholic faith. He did it on records. And for those young people like yourself, we used to have to play records and then flip it over the other side to hear both sides of it, not like CDs. So those are the old media. But this is a terrific thing. We certainly would love to see him, because the wisdom and insight that he had for American society captured people all across the board. And he was the #1 television show when he was on in the 1950s. He knocked off the entertainment leader at the time, Milton Berle, who was named Mr. Television. And matter of fact, he liked to tell the story of meeting Berle. And Berle said, "I was #1. How did you knock me off?" And Sheen said it was easy. I had better writers: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah, you stole my punchline there, Father. I was going to relate that. I include that in the book, They Might Be Saints, the sort of the relationship between Fulton Sheen and Milton Berle, their little competitive rivalry, so to speak, to get that top slot. So
yeah,
he really had a huge impact in America.
And he would joke about Berle. He said one joke was so funny, even Berle dropped his pencil from copying it down. So he would joke. He had a great sense of humor. And in terms of any of these other saints, do you see any other elements that we need to know about them?
Well, one of the interesting things about the future of sainthood causes is this fourth path to sainthood. We all know, or we all know the third path: martyrdom, a heroic virtue. I guess one side is papal prerogative, where the Pope, if he so likes, can make somebody a saint. But this fourth one is this oblatio vitae, the giving up of one's life for another. And so we see these cases of military chaplains, perhaps the Grand Padre, Vincent Capodanno,
Yes.
or Father
Yes.
Emile Capon from Kansas.
Yes.
There's this new path to canonization that was recently set up just a couple of years ago now, that some of these people might qualify for. So I think we have to keep our eyes open to this new way, perhaps, that we might see some new saints.
Yeah, someone like Stanley Rother is another one.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about him, if you can.
Sure. Blessed Stanley Rother, he is actually one of the martyrs in the book, and I hope to do an episode of They Might Be Saints on him someday. But he was from Oklahoma City, and he was sent on mission. And he was actually, and we have the story also of Blessed James Miller from Wisconsin. Similar, grew up here in the United States. They went to South America, and they were killed actually serving their local communities there. And they had the ability to leave, but as is said about Blessed Stanley Rother, the shepherd does not run. And so he stayed with his people, and he was martyred for the faith because he was a symbol of Catholicism, and he was declared blessed just a few years ago. So we have these two blesseds, and as blesseds, they only need one miracle. So they've been martyred, they've been declared martyrs, but one more miracle will make them a saint. So that's up and coming. I think two possibilities for the next saint.
Yep. And you know, a lot of folks don't realize, well, martyrdom is a horrible thing. You know, and some of the martyrs have suffered tremendously for the faith. But, you know, the church teaches that they don't even have to go to purgatory, that their martyrdom replaces anything in purgatory. I think that had motivated a number of people to stand firm, that they knew that this life is short anyway, and standing firm in the faith and laying down your life for either the service of others or dying for Jesus Christ, this is a sure path to heaven, and many of them have chosen that. And again, it's a wide variety of kinds of saints, whether their ethnic background, their country of origin as immigrants, where they ended up serving, because many of them left America to go to other places in order to be missionaries. All of these are just wonderful stories. And I would hope, as I mentioned before, a lot of ignorance about American history, that your book would be a jumping off point for a lot of people to study more American history in light of the saints who truly bring the light of Christ to it.
Yeah, I hope so. And with this book, I'm hoping it opens up some difficult conversations within families. We have people who have fallen away from the Catholic faith or might need to learn about the Catholic faith. And I'm going to be giving out my book as a gift and putting in a little card and saying, I wrote about this saint, and I think you might like to learn about them. So I'm going to try to spread the word on the saints, and people can learn about the faith through these incredible examples. So I'm hopeful to be able to.
That sounds very good. Again, the book is called They Might Be Saints on the Path to Sainthood in America by Michael O'Neill. It's item number 82248 at ewtn.rc.com. We've run out of time. Sorry about that, but may the Lord bless you and all of our audience, the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless and thank you.